What's going on, everybody? This is Sean of Raw Stuff Music. Today I want to talk about this album right here. This is Squarepusher's Go Plastic, released on Warp Records on June 25th, 2001. This might be my personal favorite Squarepusher album, so I'm not going to waste any more time on an introduction, and let's just get into this thing. Go Plastic was a bit of a change on all fronts for Squarepusher. First, it represented the first lengthy gap between releases for the prolific producer, as most of his EPs and full-lengths all came out within a year of each other. Two, it saw him completely ditching his organic live instrumentation sound that he was toying with to some degree, even on releases as late as Selection 16. And with this album, he went all in on electronics and samples to power his sound. Though according to Wikipedia, he didn't use a computer in the making of this album and instead did it through a range of different hardware. In an interview with Tech TV in 2001, he explains in his own words what he wanted to do with this album.
The thing I always gravitated towards was drum breaks. The idea of like sampling the drum breaks was the first thing I wanted to do, and then cutting up the breaks so that you could almost like mimic a drum beat. And then after a while you sort of go, yeah, I want to do things that drummers can't do, you know what I mean? Like I started off using like a DR660 drum machine, and when the guy demoed it for me in the shop, he was like, check this out, man. And it was just like this really disgusting like Queen rock drum beat, and it was just like, this thing's horrible, but I thought, oh, it's a drum machine, I want to get a drum machine, so I'll get it. And over the years of working with it, I end up doing like granular synthesis with like a drum machine, because it's just like, you're going like, you know, like, and like the people who made a DR660 had never made it to do those things. It just happened that it's got the facility to do it, but they never even thought about it. But it's just like any instrument, if you spend long enough with it, you can mutate it. I've got fed up with like trying to use live instruments. I'm bored of it, you know, I just sort of want everything to be so brutal and digital. What I'm into doing is just starting off with more fundamental, like basic sounds and stuff, and doing all the tweaking and all the sort of ripping apart, doing all that in the sequencing. Once it's all turned into data, then you can really start like mucking around with it, like in a totally like way that you can never do with like tape machines and instruments, you know, because that's ultimately like one of the things that's good about electronic music. Like you can just do things that are totally beyond like a pair of hands, you know what I mean? It's a pretty basic setup, you know, it's just like sequencer, sampler, DSP, processing, that's it. I mean, I've always been into the idea of bass becoming a really kind of far more colourful sort of kaleidoscopic thing than it traditionally is, you know. But I don't know if it's just because of my attitude, like I like to take something and make it do what it's not supposed to do. The traditional roles of like drums and a bass and a sort of melody thing, like making them so that they can actually appear to swap places and stuff, you know. Like almost like the drums becomes the melody, or the bass becomes the melody, or the melody becomes the drums. All the pioneers, like, you know, like even like Jimi Hendrix, you know what I mean? When he first started like turning the gain up on his Marshall and that, and like feeding it back, it was just like, what's going on? But it, you know, he's doing something that a guitar wasn't supposed to do, but he revolutionised music through doing it.
Ultimately, the reviews in aggregate were largely positive, but there was still a sense that people were hoping Tom would go back to his more jazz-infused sound and less noisy aspects of his music. But where do I stand in all of this? First off, I think this is probably his most focused album in his entire catalog. Seemingly, everything just feels so much more focused and deliberate. On top of that, the sound on here feels so much more unified than anything else that he had put out up until this point, where a lot of his albums felt like a hodgepodge of different ideas that he was playing around with. Everything on here just feels so much more concentrated and so much more concerted, which is why I think it feels like one of the most unified listens of any album in his catalog. But when I say concentrated, I think the one thing that really separates this album from everything else that he had done was there is just an extreme laser-like focus on the one element that always stood out in his music, but never really seemed like it was the central focus of his music, and that is the drum break. To me, it really feels like Tom Jenkinson, aka Squarepusher, on this album is putting all of his energy into seeing how he can stretch, pull, manipulate, chop, dissect, just utterly mash and obliterate the drum breaks on here, whether it's Amen or any other drum sample that he's playing around with on here. To me, what he's doing on this record is really showing off like the insane things that you can do when you put all of your energy and all of your focus in cutting the shit out of that Amen or whatever drum break that you want to. There are still moments of melody, sub bass, soundscaping, sound design, atmosphere on here, and that really does keep the album from being too monotonous, but the entire album is really tied together through the thread of the focus on the drums on here. And I think that's one aspect of this record that makes it such an enjoyable listen for me. At first, it's really sort of off-putting, especially because Red Hot Car really gives you the sense that while you are going to be hearing some really insane cut-up drums, you are still getting that really cool melody and super addictive sub-bass line, as well as that really cheeky sample that adds a little bit of a vocal hook to it. The main element of this song is how he goes about just absolutely cutting, pasting, rearranging, and just making an absolute insane collage of the drums on this track. But if the only song that you had heard on here was My Red Hot Car, the second track on here, much like Music for One Rotted Note, with chunks being a rather poor representation of what the whole album sounds like, Bonneville Occident really is a slap across the face in terms of what you're gonna hear on this album, because My Red Hot Car is sort of the appetizer to the real main course, and everything from this track is pretty much consistent throughout the entire album. The drums just get even more insane over time. The melody takes an increasingly backseat to everything else on here, and while there are little bits of melody, they're really strained and really not even meant to be the focus of this song at all. And as the track goes on, more sounds and more layers and just more digital, disgusting, crunchy, ugly drum breaks just keep continuing to sort of pile onto each other. And I swear to God, I am not trying to make my description of this track one long car analogy, and it just sort of ended up that way. Bonneville Occident really just sets up pretty much the majority of the tracks on here, as most of the elements in this track are contained in other songs on this album. There are things that sort of separate each track on here, and whereas one of my complaints with Music is One Rotted Note was that it felt like everything started to blend together over time, even despite the fact that there isn't really much focus on melody on a lot of the tracks, although one of my favorite songs on here, The Exploding Psychology, actually has this like really cool, almost science labby, experimental vibe to it that I just absolutely love. On top of the fact that it really plays back and forth with its tempo rather than just continuously going at 200 miles per hour, it goes through shifts starting from a halftime to more of a full-on drill and bass burner and jumps back and forth between that, and it really is what makes this song so interesting. Same thing with Go Spastic. Does sort of the same thing, and then halfway through sets up this really cool boom-bappy drum break with some really DJ scratch-like sound effects that really give this song a lot more of its audio interesting element to it. That was kind of weird, but we're still gonna go with that. And this sound really comes to a head with the late album lengthy cut Greenway's Trajectory, where he completely abandons the idea of melody altogether and just makes this utter cacophony of drum breaks, intricately slamming up against each other to the point where the sample gets stretched so far that it becomes a dog whistle tone that actually made the people that I was driving around in my car years and years ago when I picked this up get so mad at me me, they were going to throw me out of that car. I never learned my lesson. I continue to enjoy this album, and occasionally I would still throw it on to piss them off. It isn't all just noise and crushed up breaks, even though it is the central sound of this album. I Wish You Could Talk brings back some of that Tundra-esque haunting melody. It's not one of the more break-focused tracks on here, but it's still a pretty cool sounding track. It's one of the more straightforward tunes on here, so it definitely breaks up a lot of the more experimental abstractness that's going on this record. Another one of the album's diversions that's actually pretty cool is the track Tomib, made famous by the Lost in Translation soundtrack, which has this just absolutely gut-wrenching melody to it. That is a track that I only wish was maybe like a minute or two longer, because it's just so short. And this track right here calls back to the sound of the more music concrete experiments on Music is One Rotted Note and Budokan Microphone. And it's not really a standout, but thankfully it's brief enough that it doesn't really break up the flow of the album too much. In fact, it comes off as a bit of a respite in what is otherwise an auditory assault throughout the roughly 45-minute duration of this album. And I really like the last track on here, Plastel Flexet, which sort of goes into this electronic-infused trip-hop, hip-hop territory that just has a really, really cool vibe. And after being beaten over the head and having these sounds destroy your eardrums for the duration of this album, it's actually a great way for the album to go out, because it's such a wonderful tonal shift and a nice little rest after the all-out endurance challenge that is this album. Overall, I absolutely love this album. It really took a while to appreciate what Squarepusher was doing on this record. I really enjoyed for the longest time more of his ambient approaches to the drill and bass sound, but I found out that later on I really missed the attention, intricately cut drum breaks that are on here. And quite honestly, since the release of this album, Squarepusher hasn't done anything remotely close to this. It's definitely not the most welcoming and most inviting in his catalog. It's definitely one of the more fun albums. It's an album that to this day I still enjoy going back to. It's the album that still makes me smile every time that I think about it. I gotta say, to me, Go Plastic is a certified classic, and I don't even have to think about this one. This album for me, right here, yeah, this is totally going in the S category. It's one of my favorite Squarepusher albums. It may not be for everyone, but quite honestly, I don't give a shit. I love this album. And while I do love this album, and I do think it was something of a creative peak for Squarepusher, his next album was no slouch either. But we'll have to get into that guy another time. So with that being said, so that's going to be it for me today, guys. Thanks as always for watching. If you've listened to this album for yourself, please let me know what you thought about it down in the comments. If you want to hear this album for yourself, please head over to my WordPress blog, because that's where I post links to any of the albums that I talk about on this channel. Make sure you're here every Sunday for Live from the Record Room, my DJ live streams where I play music like the stuff that I talk about in these videos, as well as a whole host of music that I don't get a chance to talk about on this channel. And make sure you follow me on Twitter, because that's where you can find out when I'll be going live, as well as check out links to any of the music that I've been posting about over on my WordPress blog. Links to everything, as always, down in the description. So that's going to be it for me today, guys. Thanks as always for watching, and I will catch you in the next video. So until then, peace out!